Good morning. So today we'll be seeing about competency number PY 8.2, description of the synthesis, secretion, transport, physiological actions, regulations, and effect of altered secretions of thyroid hormone. So I'm Dr. Devi Nithiya, Associate Professor, Department of Physiology. So today's learning objectives for the session would be to describe the steps involved in the biosynthesis of thyroid hormone, then regulation of thyroid hormone, then the physiological actions, and also the clinical features of hyper and hypo secretion. So at the end of this class, you should be able to answer all these questions. So the schema of the class would be in this following series. So first we'll be seeing about the regulation of synthesis. Next, the mechanism of synthesis. Then the mechanism of action of the hormone and also the physiological effects. So all of you know that thyroid hormone is secreted from the thyroid gland. So what are the hormones which are secreted? It is T3 and T4. So where is this thyroid gland situated? So it is present in the front of the neck, and it is typically described as a butterfly shaped organ. Okay. So when you look at the organ histologically, what you see is this contains many follicles. Okay. So what is this follicle? So here you can see that a follicle is made up of cells around, yes, and there is colloid material inside. So these cells which are lining the follicle are usually the cuboidal epithelial cells, and the material which is there inside the follicle is called as the colloid. The thyroid gland histology also shows the capillaries, the C cells, and also the red blood cells in their cut section. So now coming about to comment on the thyroid follicle, you can predominantly see two types of follicles. So if you notice in picture A, what you can see is the follicles are quite large with lots of colloidal material, whereas the lining, that is the cuboidal epithelial lining, you can see that the cells are not exactly cuboidal, but they are more flattened. And in the other compartment, you can see follicle B, where the follicles are quite small when compared to that of A, and you can see that the colloid material is very less, but the epithelial lining is made up of cuboidal cells which are quite larger. So why does the thyroid follicle have to present itself in two different forms inside the thyroid gland? The answer to this is the A. This figure A represents inactive follicles. So these follicles are said to have more of colloid material and they have flattened cells. Whereas this colloid, follicle B, they are called as the active follicle and they have cuboidal epithelium and they have less colloid. So the answer here is when the cells are more active, they tend to be cuboidal. They are actually the cuboidal cells. Okay, and they secrete more and more of the hormones. Whereas the inactive follicles, the cells are the flattened epithelium which remain silent. Next, moving on to the regulation of thyroid hormone synthesis. So this is a typical example of the negative feedback mechanism. So all of you very well know that the hypothalamus is the head ganglion. So this is the master ganglion which is going to send the impulses for the secretion of thyroid hormone. So how does it do it? The hypothalamus produces thyrotropin releasing hormone. So what is the function of the thyrotropin releasing hormone? This is going to act on the anterior pituitary. So it goes and stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce another hormone called as the thyroid stimulating hormone. So this thyroid stimulating hormone is going to target on to the thyroid gland and make the follicles to produce more of thyroid hormones. Okay. Once the level of thyroid hormones increase in the circulation, a homeostasis has to be maintained or achieved so that the thyroid hormones don't get secreted beyond the normal levels in excess. So a negative feedback mechanism is initiated which causes the inhibition of the production of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. So the thyroxine here will act as the product which is going to inhibit the production of its own. So thyroxine, when it is present in excess, will inhibit the anterior pituitary and hence the production of thyroid stimulating hormone decreases. Similarly, it also has some effect on the hypothalamus and it causes a decrease in the production of thyrotropin releasing hormone 2. So excess of thyroxine in the blood will inhibit both the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus and hence it will decrease its own production. So this is called as the negative feedback mechanism. Next, we'll move on to the synthesis of thyroid hormone. So what is the most important component for the production of thyroid hormone? It is iodine. Okay. So where is iodine present? It is present in the blood. So it is present in the capillaries. What is the source of this iodine? It is predominantly the food that we consume. Okay. So the iodide ion which is present in the bloodstream has to enter into the thyroid gland in order to help in the production of thyroxine. So before we go on to the process, can we have a brain teaser? The actual level of fortification during salt processing must be. So the answer for this is nothing but the amount of iodine that has to be present in your food. So the recommendation says that it should be at least 30 milligrams of iodine per kg of the iodized salt. So to prevent iodine deficiency, common salt is iodized with about 1 part of sodium iodide in every 100,000 parts of sodium chloride. So the requirement per day is around 150 micrograms for an adult. So now this iodide, is it enough that it is going to be present in the blood? No. And how does this enter into the follicular cells? So for the entry of iodide into the follicular cells, there is a specialized channel on the basolateral membrane of the follicle. So what is that ion channel? It is the sodium iodide symporter. So why is it called the sodium iodide symporter? It's because it can transport sodium as well as iodide through the channel. And why is it called a symporter? Because it transports both the ions in the same direction. Now trying to recall what is the transport mechanism which is involved here. It is the secondary active transport. So what is the source of ATP? The source of ATP is the sodium, potassium, ATPase pump which will help in maintaining the sodium gradient. So the sodium outside the cell is maintained at a higher concentration when compared to the inside. So the sodium ion tends to move from the outside to the inside of the cell. So when the sodium ion moves from outside to inside of the cell, it also pulls along with it the iodide ions. So hence it is called as the secondary active transport. So now once the sodium and iodide are taken back into the cell, the iodide trapping occurs. So iodide trapping increases the intracellular iodide concentration by around 30 times. So here the oxidation of the iodide ion into iodine by the enzyme peroxidases occur. So no more it's in the ionic form, it becomes the iodine molecule. In the meanwhile, there is also thyroglobulin which is getting synthesized inside the follicular cells. What aids in the production of thyroglobulins are the organelles, that is the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. So once the thyroglobulin is synthesized inside the follicular cells, they are exocytosed into the colloid, and this thyroglobulin enters into the colloidal matter. So these thyroglobulins are quite large molecular weight substances. Next, what happens is the organification of thyroglobulin. So this iodine, which is present inside the follicular cells, finds its way outside into the colloid by a channel called pendrin. Now this iodine combines with thyroglobulin, and this process is called as the organification of thyroglobulin. And there is formation of monoiodothyrosin and diiodothyrosin inside the colloid. Next step is coupling of the iodothyrosin molecules and formation of T4, T3 and reverse T3 molecules happens. And next is the storage of thyroglobulin in the follicular colloid. So once the hormones are produced, they are directly not released into the circulation. Only on demand, when the hormone level needs to be increased, these colloid hormones are released from the colloids. So when there is a demand, the endocytosis of the thyroglobulin molecule occurs and it enters into the follicular cells. Inside the follicular cells, they fuse with the thyroglobulin, this fusion of the thyroglobulin with the lysosomes, and there is action of the enzyme proteases which will release the free T3 and T4. Now the T4 enters into the circulation and it binds with the thyroxine binding globulin and it is carried to the target organs. So what is the significance of the plasma protein bound hormone? So this acts as a reservoir for replenishing the concentration of free hormones when they are bound to the target receptors or lost from the circulation. So this also helps in slowing down the hormone clearance from the plasma. And what are the proteins that are involved in this binding? It is the albumin, the globulins, and the TBPA proteins. So this is in one picture what we have described so far. So if you can follow my cursor. So this is the sodium potassium pump ATPase, which will act as a source of ATP. The iodide enters into the cell by the help of sodium iodide symporter, which uses the energy created by sodium potassium ATPase because of the the gradient, which is concentration gradient, which is created by the sodium ion. So the sodium ion moves inside the cell, and along with sodium, iodide also moves. This iodide ion enters into the colloid with the help of pedrin. Then side by side, what happens is the thyroglobulins are produced, and they also enter into the colloid. And inside the colloid, there is iodination and the coupling reactions taking place, and the formation of the complex occurs. This finally helps in the formation of the monoiodothyroxine and the diiodothyroxine, and this enters back into the follicular cells and it is secreted into the blood as T3, T4 and reverse T3. So next we'll move on to the mechanism of action of thyroid hormone. So the thyroid hormone acts on the target organs with the help of the thyroid hormone receptors, which are the nuclear receptors. So in the circulation, we have the T3 hormones, which are in the active form, and this enters into the cell. Once it enters into the cell, it gets converted to T3 with the help of mono-deiodinase. So once T3 is formed inside the cell in the cytosol, this goes and binds to the thyroid hormone receptor, which is present on the nucleus. This hormone receptor complex binds to the thyroid response element, which is present on the DNA. This is a segment on the DNA which initiates the mechanism of action of the thyroid hormone. So along with this comes and binds the retinoid X receptor. So once the hormone receptor complex binds with the RXR, there is transcription and translation process occurring, which helps in the production of the required proteins to act on the target organ. For example, the sodium potassium ATPase pump. So coming on to the non-genomic actions of thyroid hormone, this helps in the regulation of ion channels by the production of different types of ion channels because they are all proteins. And then it helps in oxidative phosphorylation, then activation of intracellular secondary messengers such as cyclic AMP and protein kinases signaling cascades. And it also is described in several tissues, including the heart and the pituitary, and also in the adipose tissue. So once again, a break. We have two statements here. One is the assertion and the other is the reason. So first is the assertion, which says that the thyroid hormone have a prolonged latent period of action on the tissue. So what does this mean? It means that thyroid hormone takes some time to produce its action on the tissue. So is it true or false? And next question is, thyroid hormone has genomic mechanisms for their physiological effects. So is this reason substantiating the first statement? So the answer here is both the assertion and the reason are true, and the reason is the correct explanation of the assertion. So we always expect that the thyroid hormone action takes some time to happen. And the reason for this is because of the nuclear mechanisms which are involved. So what are the physiological actions of thyroid hormone? First is it has an effect on the cellular metabolism and the metabolic rate. It has effect on growth, metabolism of carbohydrates and fat, on cardiovascular system, nervous system, respiratory system, cardiovascular system, gastrointestinal system, on the skeletal muscles and on the reproductive muscles. So thyroid has its action on almost all the systems of the body. So let us see one by one. How do they have their effect? So thyroid hormone increases the cellular metabolism. So what does it do? It increases the number and the activity of the mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, and hence they help in increasing the production of ATP. Next is it increases the active transport across the cell membrane with the help of sodium potassium ATPase, because we already saw that thyroid hormone is involved in the production of proteins, and one such protein which is produced is the sodium potassium ATPase pump. So when the sodium potassium ATPase pump is active, there is a lot of heat and ATP which is produced. So this increases the heat production, and in turn the cellular metabolism also is increased. So if you see this thyroid hormone, it has its own regulation also. So that's why the basal metabolic rate is so much dependent on the region where we stay and also the activity of the individual. Say for example, in individuals who stay in very cold regions, the BMR of the individual is usually higher because the heat production has to be higher in order to maintain the core body temperature. Okay, so there is higher incidence of goiter in cold areas. And of course, in cold, there will be thyroid hypertrophy and there will be new levels of thyroxine. The higher levels which are achieved, they set a new higher level. And hence there is an increase in the metabolism and increase in body temperature to manage the cold in the surrounding environment. So this is called as the geographical variation in BMR due to the adaptation of the thyroid hormone. Next, thyroxine also acts as a chemical thermogenetic factor. Okay, so this hormone, it increases the metabolism and activates the uncoupling proteins UCP1, 2, and 3, and it increases the rate of cellular metabolism. Next, when seeing about what effect it has on the basal metabolic rate, when the thyroid gland is completely removed, the BMR can be almost 40 to 50 times below the normal value in an individual who usually has a particular level of BMR. Okay, and also when there is an extreme excess of thyroid secretion, the BMR can be increased by 60 to 100% or even more than the normal. So the thyroid gland, since it has a lot of action, a lot of effect or an influence on the BMR, it has to be adequately perfused. So how much is the perfusion or the blood supply to the thyroid gland? It is around 50 ml per minute, which accounts to around 160 ml per minute for every 100 gram of tissue weight. And this is totally accounting to around 1% of the cardiac output. So next we'll see the effect of thyroid hormone on the growth. So thyroid hormone aids in musculoskeletal growth and development and also promotes the gene expression for growth hormone and facilitates the growth hormone action. So it directly has an effect on the musculoskeletal system and also increases or facilitates the action of growth hormone. So this chart here denotes figures which are shown for the first figure. If you notice, it is the one which denotes a normal 2-year-old, and the last figure, this denotes a normal 8-year-old. Okay, so you can see here that for a normal 2-year-old, the pubic symphysis is here at 15 when the total height of the individual is at 35 inches. Okay, so which portion is higher, the lower segment or the upper segment? It is the upper segment. Whereas in an 8-year-old, if you consider, the pubic symphysis level is somewhere at around 65, say. Okay, and here the height is around 130. So here you can see that the upper segment, lower segment is almost equal. So what I would like to convey here is, In a 2-year-old, the upper segment is longer than the lower segment, and in an 8-year-old, the upper segment and the lower segment are almost equal. Whereas, when you consider a hypothyroid individual of 8-year-old, okay, he will mimic the features of a normal 2-year-old. So it means that the upper segment, lower segment difference is not achieved, and also the total height of the individual is not achieved. Okay. Whereas in a dwarf who is not a short statured because of hypothyroidism, the other causes of being short statured is dwarfism, which is because of the growth hormone deficiency. In case of an individual who is 8-year-old and having a growth hormone deficiency, you can differentiate him from a person with hypothyroidism by checking the upper segment lower segment ratio, where the individual has achieved equal upper segment and lower segment in case of growth hormone deficiency. Whereas in thyroid hormone deficiency, the upper segment is still longer than the lower segment. There are other features also which can distinguish a hypothyroid individual, that is a cretin. Okay, short statured hypothyroid individual is also called as a cretin. So there are also other features which can distinguish a cretin from a dwarf. Okay, that we'll see later. So what are the effects of thyroid hormone on carbohydrate metabolism? The ultimate aim is to increase the glucose uptake by the cell, increase the glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, rate of absorption from the GIT, and also the insulin secretion. So basically the sugar levels would be high. Okay, it is tempting the balance towards an increase in the glucose uptake and glucose metabolism. Whereas for the fat metabolism, this will increase the mobilization of fat from the adipose tissue and decrease the fat stores, and also will increase the free fatty acid levels in the plasma and accelerates the oxidation of free fatty acids. So hence, when the thyroid hormones are deficient in case of hypothyroidism, there occurs hypercholesterolemia, that is increased concentration of cholesterol in the circulation. Next, we'll see about the effect of thyroid hormone on the cardiovascular system. So this has two effects. One is a direct effect and the other is the indirect effect. So via the direct effect, there is an increase in the beta receptor sensitivity to the catecholamines in the SA node. So when the catecholamines sensitivity is increased in the SA node, there tends to be an increased impulse production. So SA node, when there is an increased impulse production, it means that the heart rate is going to increase and hence there is tachycardia. And the next mechanism is by stimulation of the alpha MHC proteins. So what are these MHC proteins? These are myosin heavy chain proteins, and also beta receptors, G protein, sarcoplasmic calcium ATPase will all get stimulated in the cardiac muscle. So all this is going to aid in an increase in the myocardial contractility and also an increase in the stroke volume. So when myocardial contractility and stroke volume increases, there is going to be an increase in the cardiac output. So because of the direct effect of the thyroid hormone, now we have increase in heart rate and also increase in cardiac output. Now coming on to the indirect effect, there is an increase in the body metabolism and in the temperature, and that is going to lead to a decrease in the peripheral resistance, which in turn is projected as a decrease in the diastolic pressure. So peripheral resistance is nothing but the indicator of afterload, and hence the afterload also decreases. So when tachycardia, this is predominantly manifested as sleeping tachycardia. So at rest also the individual will have an increase in the heart rate, and the cardiac output increases, and this will lead to an increase in the systolic blood pressure. And you have already noted that there is a decrease in the diastolic blood pressure, And so an increase in systolic and a decrease in diastolic blood pressure will together contribute to a wide pulse pressure. When the wide pulse pressure is prevalent, it denotes that there is an increase in the volume of the pulse, and hence that leads to water hammer pulse in case of hyperthyroidism when the thyroid hormone levels are very high. Next, moving on to the effect of nervous system. It helps in the proliferation of the axons, development of synaptic connections, development and synthesis of neurotransmitters, and also increases the number of receptors for the neurotransmitters, and helps in the myelination of neurons, growth of cerebral and cerebellar cortex and basal ganglia, and it all helps in general alertness. So, when an individual is hypothyroid, when the secretion of the thyroid hormone is less, there may be sluggish tendon reflexes, prolonged reaction time, and mental retardation. Next, moving on to the effect on the respiratory system, it increases the respiratory rate and the minute ventilation, and also increases the partial pressure of oxygen in the arteries, and also increases the oxygen supply to the tissue. And on the and on the gastrointestinal system, it will enhance the motility and hence increase the appetite, food intake, and glucose absorption from the gut. Next, its effect on the skeletal muscle, which we already saw. There is going to be an increase in the expression of MHC gene, and that might lead to muscle cramps and weakness in case of hypothyroidism when the thyroid hormone levels are less, or it can also lead to thyroid toxic myopathy when the in case of hyperthyroidism. And the effect on the reproductive system in females, it helps in the ovarian follicular maturation and in ovulation, and in males it helps in spermatogenesis. So any defects or alterations in the levels of secretion of the thyroid hormone will definitely affect the fertility of the individual. So now moving on to the last session, that is the section of the session, that is the altered levels. So first about hypothyroidism. They can be either primary hypothyroidism or secondary hypothyroidism. Primary, the problem is within the gland, that is the thyroid gland. And in secondary, the problem might be either at the pituitary level or at the hypothalamic level. So this is predominantly hypothyroidism is because of iodine deficiency, or the drugs which interfere with iodine trapping mechanisms, and the drugs which interfere with the organification of iodine, or it can be because of the Wolff-Chaikoff effect. So when iodine levels are less or more, so when iodine levels are less, it will lead to iodine deficiency and defective or deficient production of the thyroid hormone. When iodine levels are more, it can be because of Wolff-Chaikoff effect or paradoxical inhibition of organification of iodine and thyroid hormone due to the excess of iodine which is present. Next, what is the reason for the thyroid swelling in hypothyroidism? When there is low levels of T3 and T4, the negative feedback mechanism actually causes an increase in the TSH level production. And this is going to cause the growth and cellular differentiation of the thyroid swelling, and hence the thyroid hormone production and the secretion of the thyroid gland has to increase. So this ultimately leads to an enlarged gland. So that's why there is thyroid swelling in hypothyroidism. So some of the presentations of this hypothyroidism are congenital hypothyroidism, myxedema, and cretinism. So we'll see one by one. So this is the congenital hypothyroidism which occurs in the newborn, where you can see that the baby has a pot belly with protruding umbilicus, and the tongue there is some difference, and the facial features also appear different. So what are the features to sum up here? In congenital hypothyroidism, it is periorbital puffiness, then broad nose, and eyes are widely spaced with tongue being large and protruding, and there is a pot belly, and there is sparse hair and also umbilical hernia. The stature of the child is small, so they'll have a short stature. There is mental retardation also present, and IQ is very less, and sexual characters are also not well developed. So that is, there is hypogonadism. So this is one of the most important differentiating feature which I was mentioning earlier, to differentiate between a hypothyroid dwarf and a growth hormone dwarf. So this is a cretin where the child is of short stature, the sexual features are not well developed, and also the mental retardation is present. Whereas in growth hormone dwarf, there is short stature, whereas the mental status or the IQ and the sexual features are all normally developed in growth hormone deficiency. Then next, coming to myxedema, it is a subcutaneous mucopolysaccharide deposition which leads to non-pitting edema. So this is myxedema. These are the features of a myxedematous patient. So you can see that there is goiter, puffiness of face, periorbital swelling, loss of hair, ptosis, dry, thick and rough and yellow skin, low BMR, hypersensitivity to cold, hoarseness of voice, memory loss, and also there is increase in the serum cholesterol levels. Hypothyroid individual in particular, they will have decrease in BMR, coarse sparse hair, dry yellowish skin, and cold intolerance. Then on the growth, there is cretinism in children. Carbohydrates and fat metabolism, we already saw that there will be hypercholesterolemia. Then on the cardiovascular system, the reflexes are slowed down, mental retardation is present, and myxedema, madness is also very not very uncommon. And for the nervous system, and for the GIT, that there is constipation. For the muscular skeletal system, there may be myopathy, and for the reproductive system, there is infertility in case of hypothyroidism. And next, coming on to the hypersecretion, this once again can be either primary hyperthyroidism or secondary hyperthyroidism. Primary hyperthyroidism is because of the defect in the thyroid gland, and secondary is because of the defect in the pituitary and in the hypothalamus. So causes of hyperthyroidism, they can be either because of the overreactivity of the thyroid gland or the presence of an extra thyroid hormone. So increased production of thyroxine, this will occur in Graves' disease, then adenomas, then multinodular goiters, and in Hashimoto's disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. Whereas in extra thyroid tissue, this can be either because of an ectopic thyroid gland, or it can be because of the administration of exogenous T3 or T4 hormones. So that is iatrogenic, or it can be induced also. Okay. So causes are Hashimoto's thyroiditis, autoimmune disorder, and it is actually a transient condition where the destruction of the follicles occur, and hence there will be release of the T3 and T4 levels, T3 and T4 hormones from the colloid. So after that period where these hormones are all released, there will be another transient period of hypothyroidism. So there is a transient increase in the thyroid hormones followed by a decrease. This is Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disorder. So next is the Graves' disease, and this is the major disease which owns this hyperthyroidism. Around 60 to 80% of the individuals who have hyperthyroidism have Graves' disease. And this is once again an autoimmune disease, and which is more commonly found in the woman. So here there are antibodies which are developed to the TSH receptors. This will stimulate the receptors and also cause thyroid enlargement, then increase the T3, T4 levels production. And because of this, there is an effect on the negative feedback mechanism, and there will be low levels of TSH which is produced. The other type of antibodies are antibodies to the thyroglobulin and the antibodies to the thyroid peroxidases. So in hyperthyroidism, the features which we expect are palpitations because of increase in heart rate, nervousness, fatigue, diarrhea because of increase in the motility, then increased sweating, heat intolerance. Then the patient will also present with exophthalmos, with swelling in the front of the neck, with an increased BMR, heat intolerance, and there may be myopathy with easy fatigability, and also chances that the person has osteoporosis, the skin is warm and moist, and the heart rate is more, and regarding the menstruation, they have scanty periods. So these are the features of an individual with hyperthyroidism. And finally, the last slide. This is just to show you how exophthalmos looks like. Exophthalmos is nothing but the protrusion of the eyeball. So when you look from side, you can see that the eyelids fail to cover the entire eyeball. So this is just an illustration of how it would look like. So with this, we have finished the topic on thyroid hormone. Thank you.